Hello everyone, and thank you all so much for joining us today for another installment of Exploring Our World, where we here at Colonial Williamsburg dive into the minds and experiences of daily life in the 18th century. I'm Stacy Loveland, and today we are here in the Paper Conservation Lab to talk about Colonial Williamsburg's collection of Virginia Gazettes and what's being done to conserve them for future generations. Joining me today are Dr. Kathy Hellyer, Pam Young, Lindsay Zachman, and working in the background here today is Perrine Lasso. Thank you all so much for being here with us today. We're really looking forward to answering all of your questions. So as you're listening, if you have anything you want to know the answer to, post it in the comments, and we're going to answer as many of those questions as we can. But to begin today, I'd like if we could start with all of you just telling us a little bit about yourselves. Let us know who you are. Kathy, we can start with you.
Oh, thank you. I'm Kathy Hellyer. I'm one of the historians here at Colonial Williamsburg. I work in the Department of Research and Digital History, Historical Research and Digital History. And I've been here 40-some years, and it's our research that supports the programming in the historic area.
Pam?
Hi, my name is Pam Young. I'm the Senior Paper Conservator in the Conservation Department. Physically, we're in the Paper Conservation Lab, as you said, and we are in the Collections and Conservation Building on the Bruton Heights campus. I've been here for 27 years, and I had the great privilege of establishing this lab, being the first paper conservator, and making paper conservation a part of this department.
Very cool.
And I'm Lindsay Zachman. I am a paper conservation fellow here. I'm a recent graduate of the Winterthur University of Delaware program in art conservation, so I'm a master's program, and the Virginia Gazettes have been my primary treatment project here.
Excellent. Well, I am so happy you all are with us today. I know it's going to be a great conversation, but before we get started and before we answer all of your questions, I want to make sure we are all on the same page talking about the Virginia Gazette, and so we have a nice video to tell us a little bit about it.
Hello, my name's Doug Mayo. I'm the Special Collections Librarian at the John D. Rockefeller Jr. Library at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. In our special collections, we have rare newspapers. These are newspapers mostly from the 18th century. We have some from the 19th century as well. The Virginia Gazette's a newspaper. So usually when you see that word Gazette, that implies authority, official authority, authoritative information, and it was often used in the names of newspapers that usually represented the government. They might have had a government contract to print. If you look at the first Virginia Gazette, that was published by William Parks and then continued on after him, it says it contains the freshest advices, foreign and domestic. So it's going to have news from Europe, it's going to have news from the American colonies, and it's going to have Virginia news, local Williamsburg news. But it doesn't really work the way we think of a modern newspaper. So Parks and the others, they don't hire men or women to go out for them and to write stories. Often what you're going to find with the news is, more locally, you're going to get what members of the community might want to see in print, or definitely what the government wants to see in print and requires ends up in the newspapers, government proclamations and notices. This is Dixon and Hunter's issue of the Virginia Gazette. You can see here it's dated July 20th of 1776. Here is the Declaration of Independence in full in print for the first time in Virginia. The foreign news is, as well as colonial news, so news maybe from Boston or New York or Philadelphia or wherever, it's just going to be lifted from other newspapers. So if I run a newspaper, one of the things I might do is I might send you my newspaper, you send me your newspaper, and we just freely print from each other's newspaper whatever we decide we think our readers want to know. So there's the news. The other thing that you're going to find in the newspaper is advertisements. When you think about the newspaper, even today, that's how newspapers make money. You sell subscriptions and you run advertisements. And so some of these issues you can see quite a lot of advertisements. There'll be advertisements in there for all kinds of things. You think about Williamsburg here and all the different shops that are in Williamsburg. You're going to see lots of ads for stray horses. So somebody's horse has run away. Oftentimes, though, with the advertisement like that, it's the person who's taken up the horse who might be running the ad. I've taken up this horse. You're going to see advertisements, or people are leaving the colony and they want to settle their debts. So anybody who owes me money, this is how you can deal with it, or I owe you money, you need to catch up with me because I'm leaving the colony soon. You'll also see lots for sale, for rent. I mean, anything you might see, you know, in a modern newspaper, basically advertising anything for rent or for sale, but also runaway ads, which is a feature that fortunately you don't see in newspapers anymore. And these can be ads for servants who've run away, or enslaved people who have run away from a plantation, from a master's shop, or whatever it may happen to be. But there's a lot of content in there that tells us a lot about this town, a lot about colonial Virginia.
Well, we can clearly see there's a lot in the Virginia Gazette to look at, but Kathy, what specifically makes the Virginia Gazette such a great resource for historians?
Well, I think it's because it shows a real cross-section of life in Virginia and in Williamsburg. There are so many things in there. There's, as Doug said, there's international news, there's local news, the ads, and so on. I think one of the things to me that's most interesting, for example, is the runaway ads for enslaved people who are absconding from their owners. And one historian called those the earliest slave narratives. There's so much information about people that you can get from those ads that you really just can't get anywhere else. You can see just all kinds of things of what is happening in town and in Virginia. And there's really no other collection like that.
That's such a good point, and I know we're really grateful to have that collection today.
We are.
But because these are so important, you know, they need to be conserved, and there's a very specific reason why they need to be conserved. So let's take a look at that.
My name is Pam Young. I'm the senior paper conservator for the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, and we are in the paper lab. Document lamination was designed as a preservation initiative to take care of fragmented, damaged works on paper, newspapers, manuscript letters, correspondence, and of course the Virginia Gazette, to make sure they lasted as long as possible. The actual process of document lamination isn't so different from the lamination that the DMV does on your driver's license. The process was designed essentially at the National Archive in Washington, D.C. in 1936. And it was considered state-of-the-art preservation at the time. There are pictures of huge hydraulic heated presses. So this was a preservation initiative designed to treat massive, massive collections of documents. And the National Archive had only been set up several years before 1936. So they were just at the beginning stages of collecting massive amounts of documents. William J. Barrow, who was a key player in this document lamination invention and promotion. He was a big promoter. He was a self-taught document restorer, so different terminology. We refer to ourselves as conservators these days, but he set up the Barrow Documentation Shop in 1932 at the Virginia State Library. It was called then, now it's the Library of Virginia. But again, early in the 20th century, things have changed a lot. The National Archives and the Library of Congress bought into it, and then state and local libraries and archives followed suit because, again, this was considered state-of-the-art. The lamination process, because it essentially melts plastic into the paper, makes it, there's much less flexibility. And you can see how this folio format, so when this was printed, it was one sheet of paper. The manufacturer of the paper, this was the size of it. And after the printer was done with it, it was folded in half. That's what we call a folio. What happens over time is that the plastic, cellulose acetate, breaks down, and one of the components of that deterioration of the plastic is acetic acid. There's a symptom of degrading laminated documents called vinegar syndrome. And the odor of vinegar is, in fact, that off-gassing of acetic acid. The result is something that looks very unnatural. The paper is the integrity of the paper is altered by the lamination process. Since 2015, when we started the project, we have fully treated about 100 documents. The Virginia Gazettes are their highest priority because they are so important for researchers within that collection at the Rockefeller Library. But there are playbills, 18th century playbills that are laminated. There is correspondence, inventories, that sort of material that was also laminated. So there are many, many more to go. Again, donor funding has been key to keeping this process going because this lab is busy, as I say, with those other collections. There are a lot of treatment needs, so we're indebted to our donors to help support the project. Although we're kind of a behind-the-scenes operation here on the Bruton Heights campus, in this way we can support the preservation of this material for all of the other important people in Colonial Williamsburg and what they do for their future use.
So Pam, what would happen to these gazettes then, having just watched that video, if we didn't remove the lamination?
That's a good question, and the answer is nothing good. And I'll show you an example of a couple of issues that are still laminated. You can see that this one is very dark. Some of the difference in the discoloration between these two issues has to do with their earlier life. This one might have been stored in an attic, for instance. Heat and light are known to cause cellulose, which paper is made from, to darken. The associated condition is brittleness, and that is certainly part of the reason why there are a lot of losses along the edges here. But you can also see that the tissue and the plastic are becoming slightly yellow. As I mentioned earlier, the way the cellulose acetate degrades, one of the byproducts is acetic acid. Paper doesn't like to be in an acid condition. It likes a neutral pH. And everything becomes more and more acidic in this environment with the breakdown of the cellulose acetate. So the darkening and the embrittlement will become worse and worse. And theoretically, there is a point of no return that the paper, there's nothing we could do. None of these are at that state yet, but if we didn't address these problems, we would lose these documents.
Well, I'm really glad that you guys are taking care of that then. And we are going to be answering your questions. Keep sending those in. But before we start answering them, we have a great video where Lindsay actually shows us how she removes this lamination. So we're going to watch that very quickly first.
Hi, my name is Lindsay Zachman. I work here in the Paper Conservation Lab at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. For any treatment, we start with really close examination of the object, and that includes doing a condition survey, writing a treatment proposal, taking before treatment images so that we have a visual record of what the object looked like before we do any treatment. Our very first step is always to make sure that we have the proper personal protective equipment, or PPE, because we are using solvents to get rid of the cellulose acetate plastic. So I do fully suit up with a half-mask respirator and goggles and gloves that are especially rated to use with the solvent, as well as a smock. And we turn on our fume extraction hood and our fume extraction trunk to make sure any fumes that are coming from the solvent will not be dispersed throughout the lab. And then we start with the solvent baths. The issues are split down the middle because during the lamination process, they did that so that they could sew through the cellulose acetate and make like a book out of them. So we first start by separating the two halves of the folio, and then each one of those individual sheets goes through the bath 6 times. They're supported on sheets of spun bonded polyester web, so they have a little bit of support and are less at risk for tearing or getting harmed in the bath, but they do 6 sequential solvent baths. The lamination is cellulose acetate plastic, but as part of that process, they lay down a sheet of Japanese tissue on both sides. So the thing that I'm peeling off is actually the tissue layer, as the plastic dissolves enough that the tissue layer can be freed. As it's dissolving the plastic, it becomes viscous and yellow and just thick and gross. So we actually do have to store it in jars that we then dispose of as chemical waste. After bath number 6 in the solvent, the object is pulled out of the bath, still supported on the spun bonded polyester, and put directly under the fume extraction trunk, which draws away the fumes as it dries. The next step is the aqueous treatment. So we start with humidification of the object. They are supported on a new piece of the polyester web that has never been in the solvent baths. It's best practice to do the humidification because it allows the fibers to kind of slowly swell. The paper in water always swells and reacts. So if we can make that transition slower, it's gentler on the paper and on the media. And once they've been humidified, I put them into a prepared water bath, 1 by 1. And I do a series of 3 baths, and you can see the water starts out really yellow as it pulls out those acidic degradation products from the paper, but each bath gets a little bit cleaner each time. So once the bath remains clean and colorless, we remove the object and they go to dry between felts. Putting the object between felts when it's wet helps us to slow down the drying process and maintain better control during the drying process. And the additional weight of just the top felt itself helps to keep the objects flat as they dry. These folios, which are the one folded sheet, had been split down the center. So one of my tasks is to mend them and put them back into their original format as they would have been in the 18th century. We often and fairly typically use Japanese tissue, which is very thin and transparent, but it has very long fibers, which makes it still very strong. So we use that as a mending tissue. And usually we use refined wheat starch paste as an adhesive. It's a very mild adhesive, and it can be softened and undone with just moisture later if we need to take the ends back off. These will be back in the library and being used by researchers. So if a mend partially comes free or is partially torn free, hopefully not, but it could be, we need to be able to safely remove the rest of it so we can redo it and have it be back in one sheet once again. Once it is completely finished with all the mending, I make a new folder for it. I put on the back in graphite a little note of its identifying number, and the folders go into a storage box, and that storage box will be returned to the Rockefeller Library so that people can continue to use these to research our colonial American history. It's really gratifying to see something go from being plastic and looking and feeling like plastic back to being something much closer to what it would have been when it was originally made. I love, as I'm working, reading little sections of the text, because it's just such a clear little view right into a very specific part of history.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that with us, Lindsay.
Yeah.
That is fascinating to see, but I need to know, how does the paper not just disintegrate when it's submerged in water? I mean, that's what I'd expect to happen, and it clearly doesn't.
That's a really good question, and one that we actually do get quite frequently, because people are surprised that we can do that kind of treatment. And it really comes down to how this historic paper was made. So this is what's called rag paper, and I mean that quite literally. It was formed from discarded rags and clothing in the historic times. So they would actually break down cotton and linen fibers into a pulp in water, and that would be formed into this sheet. So as it's formed, these longer, cotton and linen fibers will entangle, and chemical bonds, hydrogen bonds, form between those fibers. And so it actually is pretty strong. So it doesn't come apart when we immerse it back in there, because it has that kind of matrix that's been formed from its creation process.
So it's more like putting clothes in the washing machine than
Exactly.
anything else.
And by contrast, household products that do dissolve in water and fall apart are typically designed to do that.
That's fascinating. Thank you. I never knew that.
Sure.
Now we have some fantastic questions coming in. Please keep sending them. We're going to start answering as many of them as we can. Ingrid is asking a great question to get us started here. Does the public have access to these old papers, whether it's coming in and seeing them in person or viewing them online? Can people watching today get to see any of these?
They can. During this time of COVID, particular in-person visits have to be arranged ahead of time. But you can see them online. And the resolution's wonderful. So if you go to Colonial Williamsburg's Rockefeller Library webpage, you can navigate through that to view the Virginia Gazettes online. And I highly recommend it. They're wonderful to read.
I second that. I know we'll post a link to that in the comments so you can check it out for yourself. I will tell you though, finish watching this video before you do. They're way more interesting than you would expect. You might get sucked in. So watch this and then go read them. Brandon is asking another question about the original Gazettes themselves and about kind of how they're made up. So Brandon wants to know, do we see any columns similar to our modern day gossip columns appearing? And then on top of that, are we seeing a society column? So parties, who wore what? Essentially, we know some of the ads that are being taken out, but what else is being discussed in terms of the human element here?
Well, kind of like a society column. It's not, just every person who's visiting someone else or whatever, but if someone's visiting the governor, we're going to know about it. If the governor has an assembly or a ball, a dance event, we're going to know about it. It will be in the Gazette. So yes, in a way. Gossip columns, kind of. Interestingly, I mean, if you look in the 18th century, they don't have journalism in the same way that we do now. A lot of people are just writing into the printer to contribute things. So you're not going to find slander and libel because those are actionable offenses. But sometimes you do find things about court cases or other sorts of things like that. So not quite a gossip column, but yeah, you're going to find out a lot about what people think.
It's always fun to come across those. I know we were talking before recording today, and you guys were saying that when you work on it, you read some stuff, and we were talking a little bit about that personal aspect of what we see and how fun that is. Now, we have some people writing with more questions about actually the conservation side of things. Christian had asked if there are other processes to conserve the paper. So clearly, no matter what era you're in, we all agree it's important to know about the things that are in the paper. We want to preserve it. But Christian points out that lamination sounds somewhat final, and I'm glad we can reverse it, but it sounds somewhat non-reversible as is and as it was intended. what is going to happen after removing the lamination? What further things can be done to preserve the documents you're working with for the future?
Well, that's a good question. I think that, a lot of that was probably shown in the video where I was demonstrating the different aspects of treatment. But after the lamination is removed, that's pretty much done in the solvent steps, because that's dissolving the plastic away, and I'm removing the tissue layers that are part of that lamination. But then I do follow it with bathing the paper, which helps to remove those acidic degradation products that the paper has built up over time, which helps to preserve its longevity. It often helps to, reduce some of the discoloration of the paper. And I spend a lot of time mending them and making them more stable. But a lot of preserving these papers really comes down to having them in a good environment long term. So that's why we make new folders for them out of appropriate archival quality materials, and they get stored in a very climate controlled environment, in boxes in the dark unless they're being accessed. So they're really protected from a lot of these potentially harmful things in the future, and that's really what helps to preserve them long term. In addition, just in terms of the information and how that can be kind of preserved and shared, I believe most of these are being digitized as well once they've been treated. So then we have an alternate copy of that information.
And that's really helpful too, so that if you want to access it and read what's in it, you don't necessarily have to handle the original either,
Correct,
right?
which then further protects the original.
And all of you out there can access digitized things. So
I just want to add something, though, to Christian's comment about it, lamination seeming rather final. As I mentioned, the lamination process really changes the nature of the paper. Despite all we do, the paper is, we think that we have most of the plastic out because we have done analysis with our resident material analyst. So as much as we can test to see that we've got all of the plastic out, we think we do. But given the extremeness of the lamination process, the paper is forever altered. So it is final in that regard. And in terms of other procedures that we might do, what I have in front of me are several sheets of another issue, which have annotations made in iron gall ink, probably by the printer, and I'll let Lindsay expand on that a bit because it's really interesting. But we will do an additional process to stabilize that iron gall ink, and Lindsay will mend, after we've done that, Lindsay will mend these in a different way with different materials based on that additional medium that we have to consider. So all the treatments are really tailored according to the needs of the object.
that's incredible that you guys are so versatile and able to figure out exactly what each specific original piece needs. That's great. Mm-hmm. Now, we do have some people writing in to ask about the things that you're using. Lindsay, I know you mentioned some of the different chemicals, the water bath and all that stuff. But Ingrid specifically picked up on the Japanese tissue mm-hmm. that you mentioned. You said the fibers were longer, but mm-hmm. what is it made from? Ingrid said it kind of reminds her of rice paper. Is that what we're looking at? Or
so
what do you have?
It's similar, I would say, to rice paper, but it is not. It is it's a long fiber Japanese paper. Typically, I think like one of them is kozo, which is mulberry, correct? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so they're very long fibers. You can see them. I don't know if you can see them, but I can try to show.
I can see it from over here.
So they're really quite strong. And I was talking about how in the process of making paper, the fibers get interwoven. So you can imagine that longer fibers would have better entanglement within themselves. So we can use papers that are actually pretty thin. It's like, for example, here I have, an area I had to mend that's over text. So I wanted it to be somewhat transparent. And so I was able to use a thinner tissue that really still allows you to see through that.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's really cool to know about. We have some more questions coming in, and please feel free to keep on sending those. We're excited to answer them here. From Doug asking about the change in the paper you're using. This technique of mending with the Japanese paper is possible because it's textile fibers that are mixing together, but today we're used to more wood pulp fiber, right? So Doug is asking, when do we see that change happening from rag paper to wood pulp? And he's also asking if wood pulp is more acidic and more prone to breaking down. Is what we produce today a little less stable?
Yes, I don't know if you want to touch on that at all, or...
Excuse me. Yeah, it's interesting that he would think of those as textile fibers, and I guess by virtue of them being rag. But those early plant fibers, bast, i.e. linen, and cotton, that was the raw material that was available. And so that's why we refer to these as rag paper. As people became more literate, things were being printed, people could read and write. There weren't enough rags to make all the paper that was in demand. And so really about early in the 19th century, there was a lot of experimentation done in finding other plant sources to make paper. There was all kinds of, literally Europe and America, they tried potato leaves, just a host of things that didn't work well. But what they finally came up with was using wood pulp. Clearly there were a lot of trees, and specifically softwood pulp, so pine trees. Yes, there is an inherent problem, we call it an inherent vice, in wood pulp paper. And so about 1870 was the date that I have in mind for the commercial use of wood pulp paper in the U.S.
We're running out of time, but before we go, what is one thing you would like to leave all of our listeners and viewers with today? Kathy, we'll start with you.
I would say please do read the Gazettes. There is so much there that you can learn about Virginia life. You can learn who's getting married. You can learn about what farms look like. You can just harvest a ton of information about what it was like to live in Virginia in the 18th century. And it's fascinating.
Really is. You are so right. Pam, how about you?
I just want to reaffirm the importance of what the conservation, this lab does in support of everything that happens with all the interpreters and the programs in the historic area. So we have this really important job of preserving these documents so they can finally go back to their home at the library and be used as primary source material for, again, all of the programs and the important interpretation that goes on over the railroad tracks in the historic area.
I would have to say that I hope people left this stream today just with a little bit more insight into conservation and kind of what we do behind closed doors. It's a really special thing that we do to have such kind of close personal contact with these items of cultural heritage. And hopefully maybe some other people will be inspired and pursue some other kinds of care of cultural heritage.
I hope so. Well, unfortunately, that is all the time we have for our conversation today. But I want to thank all of you for being here, for joining in this conversation, and for sharing your knowledge and insights with us. This has been incredible. So thank you. Yeah. And a big thank you to all of you out there as well who watched and listened and sent in your questions. It's been a great afternoon. Now, this program today was made possible by generous gifts from our donors, and we would especially like to thank the donors who made it possible not only for Colonial Williamsburg to produce programming like this, but also who have made it possible for Colonial Williamsburg to acquire and conserve this collection of the Virginia Gazette. You make it possible for the future to learn from the past. Today's program is our last Exploring Our World live stream for this season. Over the summer, we'll be working hard behind the scenes to bring you new and exciting content when we return with live programs this fall. You can continue to watch Trades Tuesdays live streams all summer long, though, and be sure to join us as Colonial Williamsburg presents Us, Past, Present, Future live streams on the third Saturday of each month. Thank you all so much for joining us over the past year. There's a lot happening at Colonial Williamsburg this summer, and we hope you'll take the time to come and visit us in person. Take care, and we'll see you all soon.